All right. Well, today we're excited to talk to Jeffrey Bilbro. How are you, Jeffrey?
I'm doing well.
Great, great. Jeffrey, you are about to release a brand new book. It's called Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news. If there was ever a book for this moment, this is it. And so Jeffrey, I would love for you first just to introduce yourself to our listeners. Give us a little bit of your story and what led you to write this book.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on today, Mark. My academic background and actually a lot of my personal interests have involved studying and reading and thinking about a Kentucky author from where you're from, Wendell Berry.
Hmm.
And so I've written about Berry and thought about his ideas of community and place. But I've also, my sort of technical specialty is 19th century American literature. And as I've studied that time period over the years, I've realized the importance or the sort of the upheaval that occurred during that time, caused by the industrialization of print technologies and the introduction of the telegraph and the way that steam powered railroads and ships accelerated transportation. And the way that all those sort of technological shifts and those changes in how books and newspapers and ideas traveled really transformed community in the 19th century American context, and in some ways led to the Civil War and a lot of doctrinal splits amongst Protestant churches in the time period. So thinking about those two kind of in some ways separate projects, I realized there might be a lot of similar dynamics occurring today with digital technologies and how those have changed the way that we consume and are exposed to news, and how the digital public sphere really profoundly affects the kinds of communities that we belong to, and even the way that we inhabit our local place communities. It's so shaped now by the broader discussions that we as individuals participate in, that aren't bound by time or place. So I guess it's kind of circuitous in some ways, but to my mind, those two influences, Wendell Berry and his thinking about community, and then the long history of media technologies kind of led me to this project on a theology of the news.
Yeah, and you really set up the next question that I had. Can you just, this is a huge question, so just however you want to come at it, can you help us understand how the ways that we've read the news, interacted with the news, how has that changed over the years, and what is significant about this moment that we're in right now?
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I want to sort of say in the book is that there are some relatively unique dynamics right now, but it's maybe less unique than we tend to think, that a lot of the transformations we're experiencing now are recapitulations, and maybe a different key, of transformations that happened in the 19th century. I think it's maybe hard for people who have smartphones to think about this, but I think that it might have been more disruptive or more crazy to live through, the invention of the telegraph than it is to live through the rise and spread of the internet. In some ways, it's kind of more the 0 to 1 shift of news, circulating by horseback versus news being tapped out over the electric telegraph. That's pretty transformational. And so a lot of the dynamics that we experience today are just the amplified ones that were first established in the 19th century. But certainly they, as I said, they are amplified, and the digital system, the digital ecosystem that we inhabit, is certainly unique in some respects too. But I think these challenges of sort of information overload and just the abundance of stuff we have at our fingertips makes it really challenging to know what to attend to, what do we need to know, how do we kind of navigate what can be a really overwhelming experience. And there's a lot of poor ways of reacting to that bounty, but hopefully there are, wise and prudent ways that we can learn to navigate the information that we now have available to us, and all the news that we can choose from. Maybe there are ways that we can think about what we should attend to and how to attend to that.
Hmm. So do you think that I don't know if it's right to say the main thing that would be unique, but one of the words you just now, one of the words that you use is the word amplified. Do you think that's one of the significant things about this moment that we're in is how amplified the news is, and just in a moment, someone like me in Kentucky can instantly know, say, what's happening on the other side of the world, and I'm instantly forming opinions about that. Is it the amplification of
Yeah,
news that makes it significant?
yeah, I think so, and that introduces kind of particular challenges for us to then know how to deal with that. I mean, I think I quote this line from Thoreau. He has a kind of a funny line about the transatlantic telegraph, which was being laid in the 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, perhaps the first news that's going to trickle over the ocean is that Princess Adele has the whooping cough or something. And the idea is, it's just, we don't need to know this, right? It doesn't actually help us, but all of a sudden we can know and be outraged or concerned about the health of the princess in England. And of course now, yeah, that has, amplified. We can get outraged and angry and excited and grieved about things so far removed from us. And sometimes we should sometimes we should attend to these things, but it's really hard, I think, to discern what's worth being upset about or thinking about or wrestling with, and what's just a distraction. And it's that kind of chaos that's hard to navigate.
Yeah. And I'd love to know that, to hear your thoughts on that. I just love that example that the Queen's health, I believe it was the example you used. Maybe I don't need to know that, because now it just seems like the world that we live in it's my right to know everything that's happening all the time. And I have got to know it. Where did that come from? Just that notion that it's my right to know every single thing that's happening in the world at any given moment.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know where it came from, but I do think what's interesting too is sometimes it gets framed as an obligation almost, right? That you are somehow obligated to be informed about everything. When that's really not reasonable and probably not healthy. Thoreau has a comment. He says, I am not, I don't need to know every president's message. That's not my responsibility. And of course, now when the presidents are tweeting, sometimes people expect you to keep up with the latest tweet. And I don't think that's healthy. We just humans aren't made to be able to attend to everything. We have to set limits. And I think one of those things that's really important is finding communities that help us know what to attend to, so that it's not just a burden on me, myself, deciding what to focus on or what to be informed about, because that can be overwhelming and put too much of a burden on the individual. We're not made to sort of navigate this landscape on our own.
Yeah. And so your book, you're giving us a theological inquiry into the news. And so just a simple question: how should Christians read the news? Is there a specific Christian way, I guess you could say, to interact with it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too prescriptive, I guess, because I do think that there are Christians have different vocations and callings, and different individuals are probably called to read the news and to attend to the news in different ways, and that's healthy. So I don't want to say this is the one way. Mm-hmm. But I guess the two sort of questions that I try to think about in that context are, how does the way that we engage with the news form our souls, and how are we being formed by our news consumption? because I think that's really important and sometimes overlooked. And then second, how does the news inform our practice of love? How does it help us better love our neighbors?
Mm.
Because if it's just sort of entertainment or the way that we get our emotional hit of the day, whether it's outrage or cheering our side on or, whatever, then I don't think that's very helpful in actually being a better Christian, loving our neighbors better or loving God better. So thinking about, I guess, the effects that the news is having on our affections and our souls, and the way that it is either helping or hindering our ability to love our neighbor is kind of the two of the things I would think that all Christians should ask as they consider how they engage the news.
And I love the connection that you make there between the way that we read the news and our spiritual formation. So can you help us to understand that? Can you help us to make that connection between reading the news and just what it does to our souls, our spiritual formation?
Yeah, and I try to explore this in different keys. Maybe I think it, for one thing, it shapes a lot about how we imagine the community that we belong to, who we imagine ourselves as members of. But on a more personal level, I think I draw on Thoreau quite a bit, actually, even though his theology is dubious at best. But I think he had some astute insight into the way that this kind of information can form us. And he talks about how he uses this kind of this dietetic metaphor and says that we can get bloated and dyspeptic from too much news consumption. He has some kind of pungent metaphors there. But I think it's helpful to think about, we talk about binging on Netflix or sort of binging on the news. And I think we intuitively sense that there is this link between our news appetites and how we satisfy that and our food appetite. So thinking about, consuming the news as a diet, I think is helpful. And we can then, think about ways of fostering healthy eating habits and maybe how that might be analogous to healthy news habits. And one of the points that Thoreau makes as well is that when we are sort of inundated by news and trivia and always getting new information, we can actually become less able to think critically and respond wisely to it. We become just sort of, he talks about sort of passive thoroughfares for the ideas and the news and the political slogans that others would send down our minds. And we can kind of mindlessly regurgitate the slogans that are fed to us. And that, I think, is dangerous, obviously. So thinking about ways to respond, I guess, more slowly and prudentially. And in particular, a lot of people in the 19th century recognized how in this media context, people tend to be more excited about, addressing the sort of spectacular symptoms of the problem and less willing to deal with the roots of social problems. And this is a very human problem. It's not a new problem. It's always harder to actually love our neighbor and easier to, find some superficial way of addressing these deep human problems. But Thoreau talks about how there's a tendency to hack at the branches of evil while we ourselves are complicit in those evils. And I also draw on Thomas Merton. I think Merton's really good at introspection and contemplation and the ways that Christians should be formed to look at our own complicity in sin and our own fallenness before we are rushed to point the finger at other people. And so much of the way that the news is packaged and sold to us invites us to kind of pick out convenient scapegoats out there to say, this is the problem for all the social ills, or this is the reason why all this bad stuff is happening, and they're the problem. And that can turn our attention away from the ways in which we might be needing to change or repent or grow in holiness ourselves.
Yeah. And that's such a powerful idea there, that just the news can get us so passionate, just impacts our emotions about issues, and we can regurgitate those talking points, but we might tweet those talking points, but we're not actively engaged in the issues. Right? That's kind of one of the problems there that you're highlighting?
Exactly. And so, Merton has this, and it's a long Christian tradition of sort of holy apathy, which can be counterintuitive. I mean, as Christians, we should care, we should love our neighbor. But sometimes, right love requires us to be apathetic or indifferent to a lot of the distractions that, as you articulate, would lead us to just repeat talking points and kind of see other people as a problem rather than recognizing the ways that we need to change. I mean, Merton is so crazy because he has these lines where he talks about how perhaps he is complicit in the rise of Nazism. He sort of thinks about the ways in which his own patterns of thought and his own tendencies are more aligned than he would like to be with with Nazism. And that's, we might think, how can a monk in Kentucky have responsibility for this political movement in Germany? But he is so he begins with his own faults, and I think that's a really healthy stance to start from, and to look to ourselves and our own sins before we take the easier route of casting blame on other people.
Yeah. Because just constantly taking in the news is not going to build that reflex in us, right? Of examining our own hearts, seeing our own sin. The news is always going to cause me to see, oh, the problem's the other guy.
Right. Right. And to be outraged or, look at that horrible murder, that's a terrible person, or look at this horrible crime, or look at this horrible system. And it's easy to kind of just surf the waves of outrage and horror and allow those to distract us from the more difficult work of growth and holiness.
Yeah. A moment ago, you were talking about how the news can actually impact our ability to think critically. I would love for you just to unpack that. Can you go into some more detail? How can just a constant diet, 24/7 news actually have a negative impact on critical thinking?
Yeah, the title is kind of a play on a couple different things, but one of the sources for the title is this line that Thoreau has: "Read not the times, read the eternities."
Yeah.
And obviously, my title is "Read the Times" because I'm not saying we should totally ignore what's going on in the world. And Thoreau actually wasn't saying that either. He was quite involved with the social dynamics and challenges of his day. But the reason he says it that way, in such a kind of a blunt way that's designed to provoke and get people thinking, is because he wants us to think about how taking in more substantive, eternal kinds of writing. He points to the classics and these kinds of texts that last, whether it be the Bible, but also other, old books, might actually help us, give us the tools to think well about the times and about the events of our contemporary world. And Wendell Berry has a nice short essay called Indefensive Literacy, where he actually quotes that part from Thoreau and talks in some detail about how being fed this sort of diet of prepackaged language, whether it's advertisements, whether it's political jargon that comes from one ideology or another, we have these sort of, you're spoon-fed all these carefully prepared, tested slogans and talking points. Then you're actually less able to think about the complexities and nuances of the real world. And we tend to live in this, jargon-laden, chaotic, noisy information ecosystem, rather than living in a world with real people that we engage in conversation that kind of goes beyond the oftentimes oversimplified um, phrases of the public sphere. So, yeah, finding ways to engage in conversation with real people that we share a common world with, and finding ways to draw upon the resources of lasting books, primarily the Bible, but not exclusively,
Mm-hmm.
are two ways, I think, to kind of resist um, the tendency to just go along with the flow and accept whatever your political or religious or whatever tribe tells you is the right thing to say and think.
Yeah. And so with all of that, what would you say to the person that might be watching this or listening to this and they're thinking, you know what, that might be true for other people, but that's not true for me. I just watch the news and nothing's happening to me. I'm just getting informed here. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think that's not true. I think, and I see it myself. If I am not really careful, I can listen to something or read a publication, and think I'm disagreeing with this. I'm thinking critically about this, but there's only so much we can attend to, or only so much we can consume each day, and do so in a deliberate, thoughtful manner. And I think it's really important to consider the formative long-term effects of the information that we consume, or the words that we take in, whether we read or listen to them. And that's why throughout the Bible, we are continually enjoined to ruminate and meditate and chew the words of Scripture, right? Because that should be the kind of formative verbal meat that we chew on. And if we replace that with something else, then our souls are going to be formed differently. So nobody, and I think intellectuals, academics like me, are people who are most inclined to think, I'm smart enough. I know what I'm doing, and I can read this stuff, and I can engage this, and I won't be affected by it. But I think a healthy dose of humility and recognition of our human limits is important in really being honest about how our habits do shape our patterns of thought and our affections.
Yeah. In the book, you ask the question, what do we need to know to love our neighbors well? And I love that connection between loving your neighbor and taking in the news, and just that even that idea that there are certain things I need to know. There are certain things I don't need to know. Can you talk to us about that connection, the connection between loving our neighbor and reading the news?
Yeah, and in part, I wanted to say that because I think it's true, and I think it's kind of the bedrock ethic that Christ gave us for thinking about our relations with other people, and in part because I think there are so many other reasons that we tend to read the news or listen to the news, watch TV, and not all of them are always bad, but they can be distracting or malformative. I think we often, read the news or watch TV as a kind of entertainment or kind of distraction, to reinforce things that we already believe. I want to read the people who tell me that why I'm right and my opponents are wrong in the political sphere or the religious sphere or whatever. But asking, why am I reading this story? What do I hope to learn from this story? What am I going to do with this knowledge? How is this story shaping my soul? Is it informing me so that I will better love and care for my neighbor or not? I think those are the kinds of questions that might help us develop more healthy media habits, I guess.
Yeah. And that question it's so simple from the standpoint of Scripture. I mean, that's at the forefront, loving your neighbor. But we rarely hear that brought into 24/7 cable news. This story, what is it telling me to think and how to treat my neighbor? Right?
Yeah, I guess that's not very profitable, right? It doesn't drive audience engagement or get people to click on more ads.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. And so, one of the things that I think about as a pastor, particularly in the moment, at the time we're recording this, it's March 2021. COVID is still a reality, and so many of the debates from last year and division from last year, it's still here on all kinds of different issues. One of the conversations that I have a lot with friends who are leaders in ministry is it just seems that the 24/7 news cycle is a powerful discipleship force, and a lot of churches are just hands in the air, just surrender. We don't know what to do here. What's your advice for that? Is there any what would you say to that church? What can churches do to equip their people so that they're discipled to Jesus and not just the latest headlines?
Yeah, I mean that's such a tough question, Mark. And I quote Tim Keller on this. He
Yeah.
had a essay or an interview a couple years ago where he talked about how for many Christians they are formed in church 1 hour a week, but they're formed by Fox News or MSNBC or NPR, whatever the news channel of sources of choices. They're formed by that. Who knows? 10 hours a week or more.
Mm.
And it's just hard for the church to compete with that kind of volume and consistency. So I think, I guess it's helpful to start recognizing the problem. And I think more and more Christians and certainly church leaders are, especially as you said, in time of COVID, where these sort of political identities seem to be stronger than our Christian identities, perhaps. So hopefully recognizing the problem is a first step, but I think, people might need to kind of take a step back from their particular news tribe, their particular news bubble, and recognize that this is a powerful discipleship force, and look towards ways of belonging primarily as members of the body of Christ in their local church. So I think, things like recovering a practice of praying the hours are easy. And there's a lot of, I think, helpful resources to do that now. It's obviously an old idea, right? The church has long recommended this. So that's not a new thing. Or just finding ways, again, not a new idea, but discipleship groups in church and small groups where there's more time spent with people face to face, thinking about your local place and the events of your time and how the gospel and the truth of the Bible applies to your life and your place and your time. And that those kinds of conversations are different than the kinds of conversations that are fostered by the mass media that's more secular in many ways, but also divorced from the practicalities of your place and your church and your community.
Yeah. So building those habits, those rhythms in our lives around those ancient practices. You talk about the daily office, fixed hour prayer. In your book, you just brought it up. In your book, you have a really powerful section about just the role that the church community itself can play, because just media will cause us to foster these other communities. Well, here's these people are conservative. These people watch MSNBC. These are my people. Can you flesh that out a little bit more? How can the church actually help people to resist that notion of just community based on political identity and those kind of things?
Yeah, that's a tough question, right? And I think you're right that it's such a pressing issue, and that the news. I guess part of my argument in the book is that we think I'm just reading the newspaper, I'm just watching TV. This is not affecting my soul. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, it is. And one of the ways it's affecting your soul is it is shaping who you imagine yourself belonging to. And we begin to imagine ourselves. I am the kind of person who reads or watches or listens to this publication. And I know who my enemies are, my outgroups are, around that. I know who my friends are around that kind of belonging. And I think it's understandable in the sense that our physical communities have, many people have talked about this, right? In the last decades, and especially accelerated by COVID, our physical communities have become thinned out in many ways. So in some ways, it makes sense that we would be looking for replacements, and that media companies looking to drive clicks and eyeballs and turn a profit would capitalize on that. But it's a problem, and I'm hoping that more and more Christians and churches will look for ways to intentionally foster community around the local church.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Like you said, so many pastors, at least that I'm speaking to, are seeing this. This is an issue that people have been discipled into another image than Jesus, and at the forefront is the news cycle. And so, so I would love to ask a couple of really practical questions. So I'm going to give you a couple of questions here. These are actually questions that I've gotten from people in my church and then other people online. And so at certain points in the book, a couple of times you actually tell people, do not get your news from TV. And so every time you said that in the book, I highlighted that. I was like, wow, there you go, right there. Okay, so unpack that. Where, if I don't get my news from TV, where should I get it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I say that several times, and I also say I don't own a smartphone, so I don't know if people are going to find me credible now. But I do think that there is actually a lot of good media out there. It just takes some work to find it, because people doing really good work are not producing clickbait, right? They're not kind of owning the headlines in the 24/7 news cycle. But one of the institutions, the publications that I have really respected over the years, and who I think is continuing to do great work now, is World Magazine. Okay. They publish a biweekly print magazine that I get. They also have a lot of stuff online, but I just enjoy the pace of a biweekly magazine. It's still relevant and current, but it's slow enough that they don't report on the latest Twitter drama or the latest, kerfuffle that 2 days later kind of blows over, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a slower cycle. And I do think there's a lot of, it depends on your calling and your interest and your line, I guess your vocation really, as to what kind of news you should be focusing on or attending to. So I think, if you're, I care a lot about agriculture and climate change and issues of creation care. So there's certain publications that I think are doing great work there. But maybe, your vocation is different than that. And I think kind of finding those core communities of people who care about that issue that you care about, but do so in a thoughtful way. So if you're really concerned about racial justice, right, find Christians who are addressing that from a grounded, rooted perspective. Or if you really care about, urban planning and healthy, modes of town design, there's great sources out there. So find a community that will help you kind of filter and think through what's going on. I think I say in the book, subscribe aspirationally, right? Like find the community that is doing the kind of work that you aspire to, that is responding to current needs and challenges in our world, that you think this is what the church looks like. And maybe it's not, it might be a Christian community, but it might include a lot of non-Christians as well. And kind of find out where those conversations are happening. And so I think I am kind of encouraged by some of these Facebook groups that are private and associated with particular publications, or other publications or online communities that have kind of walls, right? And they're not trying to be all things to all people and just drive traffic and just get big, but they're trying to promote thoughtful, sustained conversation around tough issues of our day. And so, the fracturing of the digital public sphere can be a problem, but maybe we can find ways to to take advantage of these smaller communities that are healthy. And you know, it's tricky because those are also the same kinds of pockets are where conspiracy theories can spread, and you know, really outrageous news and not healthy news can spread. So it's not an easy solution, but I do think, you know, finding places where the church gathers to think about issues of the day is there's opportunities to do that today, even if it's not always easy.
Yeah. And we're avoiding clickbait, you know, those kind of things. And one clarification too, because I can just hear somebody that watches this or listens to this, and when we talk about how you say don't get your news from TV, is the person who would say, well, absolutely, because of the liberal media, and so I don't watch, you know, ABC and NBC. You're talking about all sides, right?
Yeah, I just think that, I mean, I you know, I think Neil Postman was pretty right about this, that in many ways, the very medium, the very form of the TV is just not conducive to thoughtful response, because it has to be so contemporary, it has to be so attention grabbing, because you'll just surf away if it's not outrageous and crazy, and if the pictures aren't gory or absurd. So I think it's almost, I mean, I really think it's almost impossible to do news TV in a healthy manner. You know, I mean, there's people like Mr. Rogers who are trying to use TV tried to use TV kind of against the grain. But I don't even know what a news channel would look like that tried to use TV against the grain of the medium. I just think it's almost impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. One question that I've gotten is, how can I know whether or not a story I'm reading online is true? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, and this gets into all the political issues as well, right? I mean, I do think it's helpful to know, this is why trust is so important, right? We have to trust the institutions that are vetting and gathering and reporting on the news, and institutional trust and the breakdown of that is a big problem. So that's why I think, that's why people turn to kind of conspiracy theories or these smaller groups that will reinforce what they already think. But on the other hand, a lot of the big institutions have failed, and there's reasons for people to be mistrustful. So I'm not saying, just follow the fact checking on X big media platform, because I think a lot of the fact checking, sure, sometimes it is biased or not telling the full story. But I do think trying to find, I sometimes there's people, maybe there's people who are experts in the field whose judgment I've learned to trust, who have a blog or a social media presence and share stories that I think, oh, these are good. But ideally, it's sort of institutions or small communities who, you think, wow, is this story about masks true or not? And you can go, what do you think? You want trusted people who know what they're talking about and who have expertise, but who also you trust. And so I think finding that mix between legitimate expertise, but also a trustworthy institution is tough. And some issues, I think, there are places I could point, and some issues it's harder. So I don't, I think fact checking and learning to check sources and learning to, dig into the facts, that's all great. And, certainly as an academic, it's the kind of thing that I try to teach my students to do when they're doing research. But I also want to recognize that it's limited because we're finite human beings and we can't research and do deep dives on every relevant issue, right? So we do need institutions that prove themselves trustworthy and then help us kind of vet and sift through the conflicting stories that are out there.
Yeah. And so I would love to hear how you do this personally. You've already mentioned, and you do it in your book as well, you don't have a smartphone, and which is where a lot of people are, they get their news, open up my phone, there it is on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. What's this look like for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, so I do subscribe to a handful of, I subscribe to our local paper that comes 3 times a week in print, and I subscribe to World Magazine, and I subscribe to some other quarterly periodicals. I think that the sort of, I like the pace of a periodical that's, relevant and addressing issues, but with a little bit of a slower perspective. So maybe, um, it's like when an issue, I'm thinking about just a few days ago, there was like the killing in Atlanta, the shooting in Atlanta, right? And so quickly, people rush to fit this into their narrative that it's all about race, or it's all about gender, or it's all about, the SBC, or whatever the issue is. They rush to overinterpret it, and I have no idea. I don't know, but I would trust that maybe in a few months or a few weeks at least, if it's something that I need to know about and think about, someone will publish a longer, more thoughtful essay that I can read, and I don't have to go out and read all the late breaking stories that change from day to day as the story kind of unfolds. So I think kind of withholding judgment and not wanting to necessarily get the newest news, but rather looking for stories that are slower, but hopefully more accurate and more nuanced.
Yeah. Jeffrey, I love listening to the way that you just, you talk about the way that you're taking in media and news. You've used the word slower and limited, and the news cycle never gives us the impression that those are an option. I heard somebody say the other day that the 24/7 news cycle wants me to believe that I'm God, that I can be everywhere at all times and know everything. And so we really do need to be intentional here, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I get this a lot from Wendell Berry and his emphasis on, place and recognizing our inherent human limits, and not trying to rely on our technology to accomplish things that we just can't or shouldn't accomplish. In this case, knowing everything about everything instantly. That's just not healthy, and it's not even necessary. So I do also want to be, and I don't want to like put this massive burden on people that says you have to have this brilliant plan for navigating the news cycle on your own. That's why I think it's helpful to find, people. I a lot of times I rely on friends, whether on social media or in correspondence, who will email me and say, "Hey, this is important. Read this." So I think having trusted friends and networks and institutions that can tell you this story does matter and here's why, that's helpful. And then it's not so much the burden on you as the individual to figure it out for yourself, but you can do this in the company of other Christians who are journeying with you on this path toward God.
Yeah. So Jeffrey, give us some hope here. This is our, it's been great talking to you. I think my last question, everybody is obviously talking about and concerned that how divided the world is. One of the big things you talk about in the book is Kairos and Kronos time. Can you just tell us what those are and why it's so important to have that kind of perspective on the time that we're in?
Yeah. I guess briefly to oversimplify things, I think those two notions of time are important because in some ways they determine the horizon of significance against which we judge and determine the significance of contemporary events. So if we have this perspective of that Kronos is the dominant mode of time, which is a kind of linear time, unidimensional time as quantified duration, then we tend to kind of slot events into the arc of history. And we think that the arc of history is either bending toward justice and we can believe in progress and technology will make things better, or humans will get better, or whatever drives this notion of progress. And then we slot events in as whether they're, showing the progress of history or anomalies that must be overcome. And I think that's exhausting and not helpful and not Christian. I think that the Gospels also rely, so I draw a lot on the prophets, actually, the Old Testament prophets, because I think they do this well. They certainly engage the events of their culture, right? They are concerned with economic problems and political turmoil, and they talk about them, but they do so by drawing on the kind of eternal drama of God, right? They do so by thinking about how these events might be fit into the drama of God's activity in the world. So Kairos, more broadly, just names the kind of the right time or the propitious time or time as a cyclical pattern. But in the Christian imagination, I think Kairos more particularly can name the dramatic time of God's work with the world. And so then we don't have to think about, how does this particular event, this political event or this social event, how does it play into the culture wars, or how does it play into the arc of human history? But rather we can try to imagine how might this event, this current event, participate in the drama of God's activity in redeeming a fallen world, and how might it be calling us to respond and participate with what God's trying to do here.
Yeah, I love it. So behind the headlines and everything is the drama of God that is ongoing. No one's reporting on that, but it's moving forward. The drama of God, God's story is happening. Is what
Yeah, and that's the good news, right? The gospel, and so that should be the filter or behind that through which we try to discern what's going on in the 24/7 news cycle.
Yeah. Jeffrey, this has been great. This is the book. The book comes out in May. Correct? What day in May?
I think the first or second week of May.
All right. We'll link to that in the show notes. This is a conversation that the church needs to have. We've got to have this conversation about who are we becoming as we're being discipled by the 24/7 news cycle. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for coming on. Anybody that's watching or listening that wants to get in touch with you, contact with you, learn more about you, where can they go?
I am on Twitter, and I have a website, just jeffbilbro.com. So I guess those are two places they could go.
Yeah. And we'll link to all that in the show notes so people can find that really easy. And great. Jeff, it's been awesome to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for being on.
Thanks very much, Mark. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks.